Hey there. Tonight, we're diving into one of the most boring topics in human history, measurement systems. But forget everything you've been told about the metric system being a triumph of rational thinking and scientific progress. We're about to discover the reality of how modern measurements were born through political violence, scientific incompetence, and a level of chaos that makes the current state of American politics look organized by comparison. If you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a quick like or subscribe. It helps more than you know. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is there. Love seeing our little global community connect through these stories. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations. You've just woken up in Paris during the French Revolution. And the first thing you notice isn't the historical significance of witnessing democracy being born or the excitement of revolutionary fervor. It's that you're being dragged before a citizen's tribunal for the crime of selling fabric using the wrong unit of measurement. And the penalty for this offense is death by guillotine, because apparently the revolutionaries take their units of length more seriously than human life. The tribunal chamber smells like unwashed revolutionaries, spilled wine, and the kind of zealous ideology that makes people think executing merchants over measurement disputes is a reasonable approach to standardization. Your accuser, a neighborhood informant whose revolutionary credentials apparently include reporting everyone who uses traditional measurements, is explaining to the tribunal how you sold cloth measured in ands rather than the new metric units that most people don't understand and can't calculate with. The old measurements are tools of aristocratic oppression. The accuser declares with the kind of certainty that only comes from not thinking too deeply about anything. Anyone using royal units is an enemy of the revolution and must be eliminated to protect the people from mathematical tyranny. This is when you realize that the metric system wasn't developed by enlightened scientists working peacefully in laboratories, but was imposed through political terror by people who thought measurement reform justified mass murder. The measurement situation in pre-metric France was admittedly chaotic, but calling it tyranny seems like a stretch when compared to actual tyranny, like, say, executing people for using the wrong units. Pre-revolutionary France operated with approximately 800 different local measurement systems, each with its own definitions for common units like feet, pounds, and bushels. This meant that a foot in Paris was genuinely different from a foot in Lyon, sometimes by margins of 40 to 50%. The regional measurement variations weren't arbitrary harassment of merchants. They developed organically over centuries as different communities standardized their local trade using whatever physical references were available. A foot might be based on the local lord's actual foot. A bushel might be the capacity of a specific basket that everyone agreed was the standard. And a pound might be whatever the town blacksmith's standard weight happened to be. This system sounds completely insane to modern ears, but it actually worked reasonably well for local trade, where everyone understood the local definitions and had access to the local standard measures. The problems arose in long-distance trade when merchants from different regions tried to do business using measurements that had the same names but completely different definitions. The commercial complications created by measurement diversity were genuinely significant. A merchant buying grain in one region and selling it in another had to navigate conversion calculations that were approximately as straightforward as filing taxes in 3 different countries simultaneously. The potential for confusion, fraud, and honest mistakes made long-distance commerce significantly more complicated than it needed to be. The legal conflicts over measurements generated enormous amounts of litigation as merchants disputed whether contracts were fulfilled properly when the measurements used for buying and selling weren't clearly defined. Courts spent considerable time adjudicating cases where both parties acted in good faith but used different measurement assumptions that led to disputes about whether the correct quantities were delivered. Economic historians debate how much the measurement chaos actually impeded French economic development. But there's general agreement that standardization would have been beneficial for commerce, while also general agreement that mass executions probably weren't the optimal implementation strategy. The economic benefits of measurement reform didn't require the reign of terror. But you got both as a package deal. Your trial reveals the political dimension of measurement reform that gets glossed over in triumphant narratives about the metric system's rational superiority. The revolutionaries weren't primarily interested in improving commerce or advancing science. They wanted to erase every aspect of the old regime. And since measurements were associated with royal authority and aristocratic privilege, they had to be destroyed along with the monarchy and the nobility. The new measurement system, being imposed through revolutionary violence, was supposed to be based on natural and rational principles that would make it universally superior to the arbitrary measurements of the aristocratic past. The meter was defined as 1/10,000,000th of the distance from the North Pole to the equator along the meridian through Paris, which sounds impressively scientific, until you realize that nobody actually knew that distance accurately, and the measurements being used to define the meter were substantially wrong. The revolutionary calendar that accompanied metric system implementation reveals how detached from reality the reformers were. They decided that since measurement reform required decimal thinking, everything should be decimalized, including time and calendars. The revolutionary calendar featured 10-day weeks, which nobody liked because it meant fewer days off. They also proposed 10-hour days with 100 minutes per hour and 100 seconds per minute, which was so confusing and impractical that it was abandoned almost immediately. The public education campaign to teach citizens the new measurements consisted primarily of threats, propaganda, and revolutionary festivals that celebrated decimal thinking while denouncing traditional units as tools of oppression. The actual mathematical education that would have helped people understand and use the new system was largely absent, leaving most citizens confused about what they were supposed to be measuring and how. The instrument distribution necessary for metric implementation was completely inadequate for the scope of the project. The revolutionary government needed to provide new measuring tools calibrated in metric units to millions of citizens who were being forced to abandon their traditional measures. But producing precision instruments in quantity exceeded French manufacturing capacity during a period of revolutionary upheaval and war. The craftsmen who made measuring instruments faced contradictory demands. They needed to produce tools with unprecedented precision and standardization, using manufacturing techniques that were developed for producing artisanal items with significant variation. The result was measuring devices that were nominally metric but actually varied substantially in their calibrations because precision manufacturing didn't really exist yet. Your defense attorney, who seems to have been assigned to you approximately 5 minutes before the trial began, makes a half-hearted argument that you were simply unaware of the new measurement requirements and meant no disrespect to the revolution. This defense strategy has the disadvantage of being true but not particularly compelling to revolutionaries who consider ignorance of metric units to be essentially the same as aristocratic conspiracy. The tribunal deliberates for approximately 30 seconds before finding you guilty of counter-revolutionary measurement practices and sentencing you to death, though they magnanimously agree to delay execution for 1 week to allow you to learn the metric system and repent of your measurement crimes. This unexpected reprieve gives you time to explore the measurement chaos consuming revolutionary France while trying to avoid additional measurement-related capital offenses. The streets of Paris reveal a city paralyzed by measurement confusion as citizens try to conduct normal commerce using units that nobody fully understands. Market vendors quote prices in metric units, while customers try to figure out how many grams are in a pound, how many liters are in a gallon, and whether the new measurements are designed to help them or cheat them through obscure conversion ratios. The resistance to metric adoption manifests through citizens quietly continuing to use traditional measurements while officially pretending to comply with revolutionary requirements. Merchants develop systems of dual pricing where they calculate in traditional units but announce prices in metric, leading to conversion errors. customer confusion, and frequent disputes about whether anyone is being cheated. As your first week in revolutionary Paris ends, you understand that the metric system wasn't born from rational scientific consensus, but was imposed through political violence during one of history's most chaotic periods. The measurement reform that's presented as enlightened progress was actually a traumatic social transformation that destroyed traditional practices and confused the population, and killed people who didn't adapt quickly enough to satisfy revolutionary zealots. Tonight, you'll sleep in a Paris that's simultaneously trying to overthrow monarchy, fight European coalitions, manage internal rebellions, and force everyone to adopt new measurements that most people don't understand. Your dreams will be filled with calculations you can't complete and measurements that keep changing. And you'll wake up knowing that you have 6 more days to master the metric system or face execution for mathematical incompetence. Welcome to the origins of modern measurement, where decimal thinking meets revolutionary violence and produces a system that's considered superior, primarily because it won the political struggle rather than because it's inherently better than the alternatives it replaced. Through force, your second week in revolutionary Paris begins with an assignment that's supposed to save you from the guillotine you've been conscripted to assist the scientific expedition that's attempting to measure the Earth's meridian to establish the precise definition of the meter. This sounds like a redemption opportunity until you realize that the expedition is a catastrophic mess of inadequate technology, political interference, personality conflicts, and scientific errors that will produce measurements so inaccurate they'll need to be corrected multiple times over the next 2 centuries. The expedition leader, a scientist named Pierre Méchain who looks like he hasn't slept in weeks and probably hasn't, explains the task with the enthusiasm of someone describing his own funeral arrangements. We must measure the distance along the meridian from Dunkirk to Barcelona with sufficient precision to calculate the Earth's circumference and define the meter as 1/10,000,000th of the distance from pole to equator, he says, while gesturing at surveying equipment that looks like it was designed by someone who'd heard about measuring angles but never actually tried it. The fundamental problem with using Earth's meridian to define the meter reveals itself immediately. Nobody in the 18th century actually knows the precise size of the Earth or the exact shape of the Earth or whether the Earth is even perfectly spherical, which it isn't. The scientists are attempting to create a measurement standard based on a physical quantity that they can't measure accurately, using equipment that's inadequate for the precision they need, while working during a period of revolutionary chaos and international warfare. The surveying technology available consists of instruments that measure angles using telescopes mounted on tripods, with precision limited by the quality of optics that can be manufactured using 18th century techniques. The instruments can theoretically measure angles to within a few seconds of arc, which sounds precise until you realize that small errors in angle measurements accumulate over distances of hundreds of miles into errors of hundreds of meters in the final calculations. The measurement process requires establishing a series of triangulation points along the meridian from Dunkirk on the northern coast of France to Barcelona on the Mediterranean coast of Spain. Each triangulation station must be precisely surveyed in relation to neighboring stations, creating a chain of measurements that extends across France through regions that are experiencing revolutionary upheaval, foreign invasion, and general hostility toward scientists who are suspected of being spies, aristocrats, or both. Your first assignment involves helping transport surveying equipment to a triangulation station on a mountain peak that provides good visibility to neighboring stations, but requires climbing for hours, carrying instruments that weigh hundreds of pounds and are fragile enough that dropping them would destroy months of work. The climb reveals why so few people volunteer for geodetic surveys. It's physically exhausting, extremely dangerous, and offers minimal rewards beyond the satisfaction of contributing to scientific knowledge that most people consider useless. The triangulation station setup requires building wooden towers to elevate surveying instruments above tree level and provide stable platforms for precise measurements. The tower construction follows engineering principles that are generous, called hopeful, and would more accurately be described as guaranteed to collapse in moderate wind. You spend days constructing structures that sway alarmingly when anyone climbs them and occasionally fall down for no apparent reason. The actual surveying work consists of spending hours looking through telescopes at distant reference points while adjusting instruments to measure angles with precision that's theoretically possible but practically impossible given the temperature variations, atmospheric distortions, and instrument limitations that affect every measurement. The scientists take multiple readings of each angle and average the results, which improves accuracy but also increases the time required to complete surveys that are already taking years longer than initially estimated. The political obstacles to scientific work become apparent when your expedition is arrested by local revolutionary committees who assume that anyone carrying complex instruments and making detailed observations of the landscape must be foreign spies or counter-revolutionary conspirators. The scientists carry official documents from the National Convention authorizing their work, but local authorities frequently don't recognize these documents, don't care about them, or simply enjoy exercising power by harassing educated people. The military conflicts that are consuming France create additional complications when your survey route passes through regions that are experiencing active warfare between revolutionary armies and foreign coalition forces. The scientists need to establish triangulation stations on high ground that provides good visibility, which is the same high ground that military forces want to occupy for tactical advantage, creating conflicts between scientific and military priorities that scientists invariably lose. The funding crisis that affects all revolutionary projects extends to the Meridian Survey, with scientists frequently lacking money for basic supplies, equipment maintenance, or even food and lodging during expeditions that take them far from Paris. The scientists are supposed to receive government funding, but revolutionary budget chaos means that promised money often doesn't materialize, forcing scientists to work on credit or personal funds that they may never recover. The international cooperation required for measuring a meridian that extends into Spain creates diplomatic complications when France and Spain are simultaneously cooperating on scientific work and fighting wars against each other. The Spanish portion of the survey requires permissions from Spanish authorities who are alternately cooperative and hostile depending on current political relationships that change frequently enough to make long-term planning impossible. The mathematical complications of converting survey measurements into a definition for the meter reveal how much the scientists don't actually understand about the task they're attempting. They need to calculate the Earth's circumference based on measurements of one small arc of meridian, which requires assumptions about the Earth's shape that are based on incomplete knowledge and theoretical models that turn out to be substantially wrong. The calculation process involves spherical trigonometry, corrections for atmospheric refraction, adjustments for instrument calibration, and various other mathematical procedures that introduce opportunities for errors at every step. The final calculation produces a value for the meter that's accurate to within about 0.2 of a millimeter, which sounds impressive until you learn that the actual distance from pole to equator is different from what the scientists calculated by approximately 2 kilometers. The meter definition error means that the natural and rational basis for the metric system is actually based on inaccurate measurements and flawed calculations, making it essentially as arbitrary as the traditional measurements it was supposed to replace. The meter could have been defined as any convenient length, but instead it was defined as a specific fraction of an Earth measurement that was wrong, creating the paradoxical situation where the meter's definition is simultaneously precise and inaccurate. The decimal obsession that drives metric system design creates additional complications when scientists try to force everything into base 10 organization, regardless of whether decimal divisions make practical sense. The insistence on decimal units produces situations where convenient measurements require awkward decimal fractions, while the traditional units being replaced often had more practical subdivisions based on factors that divide evenly. The kilogram definition reveals another arbitrary choice disguised as natural principle. The kilogram was supposed to be the mass of 1 liter of water at a specific temperature, which sounds scientifically rigorous until you realize that water's density varies with temperature, atmospheric pressure, and dissolved impurities in ways that make precise mass standards impossible to maintain. The scientists eventually abandoned the water definition and simply declared that one specific lump of metal stored in Paris would be the kilogram standard, making the fundamental unit of mass depend on a physical artifact rather than any natural constant. The temperature scale confusion demonstrates the arbitrariness of measurement choices even within the metric system. Anders Celsius initially proposed a scale where water froze at 100 degrees and boiled at 0 degrees, which was later reversed to create the modern Celsius scale. The Fahrenheit scale that Americans still use was based on different reference points but is actually more precisely divided for human temperature ranges, making it arguably more practical for everyday use, despite being denounced as irrational by metric advocates. The time decimalization failure represents the most spectacular instance of metric logic, meeting practical reality and losing decisively. The revolutionary government seriously proposed dividing days into 10 hours, hours into 100 decimal minutes, and minutes into 100 decimal seconds. This system was so confusing and inconvenient that nobody used it even under revolutionary pressure. And it was abandoned within a few years because changing measurement units for length and mass is one thing, but trying to change how humans experience time proved impossible. The calendar reform that accompanied metric system implementation created 10-day weeks and renamed all the months with terms based on seasonal characteristics and natural phenomena. The revolutionary calendar was supposed to eliminate religious influences and promote rational organization of time. But mostly, it confused everyone and made it difficult to keep track of what day it was, according to both the revolutionary and traditional calendar systems that coexisted awkwardly. The angle measurement reform proposed measuring circles in 400 gradients instead of 360 degrees, which has the decimal advantage of dividing circles into convenient decimal fractions, but the practical disadvantage of being completely incompatible with astronomical observations, navigation tables, and centuries of mathematical work based on degree measurements. Gradients were briefly popular among some mathematicians but never achieved widespread adoption because the advantages didn't justify retraining everyone who used angle measurements. The instrument precision requirements for implementing the metric system exceeded the manufacturing capabilities available in revolutionary France. Producing meters, kilograms, and other standard measures required precision, metalworking, and quality control that were difficult to achieve consistently. Every measuring device was supposed to be calibrated against official standards, but the calibration process introduced variations that meant different meter sticks weren't actually identical lengths. The standardization enforcement mechanism consisted primarily of government officials inspecting, measuring instruments, and destroying any that didn't conform to official standards. Which sounds effective until you realize that the officials often couldn't accurately measure whether instruments were correct and frequently destroyed perfectly good tools while approving inaccurate ones. As your second week ends, you've witnessed the scientific foundation of the metric system being constructed through inadequate measurements, flawed calculations, and arbitrary choices that are justified through appeals to nature and reason but are actually just as arbitrary as the traditional measurements they're replacing. The expedition has made some progress in surveying the meridian, though the measurements won't be completed for several more years and will need correction when later scientists discover the errors. Tonight, you'll sleep in a mountain camp where scientists are arguing about calculation methods, while revolutionary authorities demand faster progress on measurements that require time and precision that political leaders don't understand or appreciate. Your dreams will be filled with angles that don't add up properly and calculations that produce different answers every time you perform them. Tomorrow will bring more surveying work in service of a measurement system that's presented as scientifically superior but is actually based on measurements that are wrong, calculations that are flawed, and political decisions that prioritize decimal convenience over practical utility. The metric system is being born through a combination of scientific incompetence and revolutionary violence, which doesn't necessarily make it wrong but does make it significantly less impressive than the triumphant narratives suggest. Your third week in revolutionary Paris begins with news that transforms your understanding of how scientific progress actually happens during periods of political upheaval. Antoine Lavoisier, one of the greatest chemists in history and a member of the commission developing the metric system, has been arrested and will be executed tomorrow for the crime of being a tax collector under the old regime. When Lavoisier appeals for a delay so he can complete his scientific work, the judge responds with the line that will echo through history: "The revolution has no need of scientists." The execution of Lavoisier demonstrates the central reality of metric system development that gets edited out of triumphant historical narratives. The measurement reform wasn't driven by scientists working peacefully in laboratories, but was imposed through political terror by a revolutionary government that was simultaneously trying to transform society and fight wars against most of Europe. Scientists who contributed to metric system development did so while living under constant threat of arrest, exile, or execution if they fell out of political favor. Your assignment this week involves working with the Agency of Weights and Measures, the government bureaucracy responsible for forcing metric adoption throughout France. The agency operates from offices that smell like fear, coffee, and the kind of paperwork that accumulates when governments try to micromanage every aspect of daily life. The walls are decorated with charts showing metric conversions and revolutionary propaganda, explaining why decimal measurements represent freedom from tyranny. The director of the agency, a revolutionary official named Prieur, whose scientific credentials consist of having strong opinions about measurements, explains your duties with bureaucratic precision. You will enforce metric compliance in your assigned district by inspecting shops, markets, and businesses to ensure they're using proper measurements. Anyone found using old units will be reported to the Committee of Public Safety for appropriate revolutionary justice, which usually means death. The measurement police force that you've just joined operates according to principles that would make modern regulatory agencies seem restrained and reasonable. The enforcement agents have authority to enter any business without warning, confiscate measuring instruments that don't comply with metric standards, impose fines that exceed most merchants' annual income, and report suspected measurement crimes to revolutionary tribunals that hand out death sentences with less deliberation than most people use to decide what to have for lunch. Your first enforcement action involves inspecting a bakery that's suspected of selling bread using traditional weight measurements rather than metric grams and kilograms. The baker, a woman in her 50s who's been making bread for 30 years using measurements she learned from her mother, that looks terrified when you arrive with official papers and measurement standards that she's supposed to understand but clearly doesn't. The inspection reveals that the baker is indeed using traditional pound weights because she doesn't own kilogram weights and can't afford to purchase new measuring equipment while running a business that barely earns enough to survive. She's aware that using old measurements is illegal but doesn't know how to convert her recipes to metric units, can't calculate prices in the new system, and has customers who are equally confused about what they're buying when she attempts to use metric terminology. The enforcement protocol requires you to confiscate the baker's traditional weights, issue a fine that's calculated as a percentage of her estimated annual income, and report her to the local revolutionary committee for further action. The woman breaks down crying when you explain the penalties, not because she's opposed to metric measurements, but because the enforcement system is destroying her livelihood for using measurements that were legal and standard when she learned her trade. The public executions for measurement crimes occur with disturbing frequency in revolutionary Paris. Though the victims are usually charged with multiple offenses where measurement violations are combined with accusations of hoarding, speculation, or counter-revolutionary sentiment. The revolutionary government discovered that executing people for measurement errors alone looks excessive even to supporters of revolutionary violence. So measurement crimes are typically bundled with other charges that make the death penalty seem more proportionate. You witness an execution of a grain merchant who was accused of using false measurements to cheat customers. Though the evidence suggests he was simply confused about conversion ratios between traditional and metric units and made calculation errors that benefited him in some transactions and harmed him in others. The Revolutionary Tribunal decided that any measurement error that benefits the merchant must be intentional fraud deserving of death, creating a legal standard where honest mistakes become capital crimes. The scientific casualties of revolutionary violence extend far beyond Lavoisier to include numerous researchers, mathematicians, and technical experts who were executed, exiled, or forced to abandon their work because of political persecution. The Academy of Sciences was temporarily abolished because it represented elitist knowledge that conflicted with revolutionary egalitarianism, eliminating the primary institution that coordinated scientific work and maintained measurement standards. The paradox of revolutionary measurement reform becomes clear as you witness the government executing scientists while simultaneously depending on scientific expertise to develop and implement the metric system. The revolutionaries want the benefits of scientific progress, but distrust the educated elite who possess scientific knowledge, creating contradictions that result in destroying the very experts needed to accomplish the revolutionary goals. The political purges that consume the revolution extend to the Metric System Commission, as members are arrested for insufficient revolutionary enthusiasm, aristocratic connections, or simply being on the wrong side of factional disputes that have nothing to do with measurement science. The commission membership changes so frequently that continuity of work becomes impossible, with new members frequently overruling decisions made by their predecessors who've been executed or exiled. The economic devastation caused by forced metric conversion affects businesses throughout France as merchants struggle to adapt to new measurements while maintaining operations during revolutionary chaos. The conversion requires purchasing new measuring equipment, retraining workers, recalculating all prices and quantities, and explaining the changes to customers who are equally confused and often hostile to metric units they associate with revolutionary oppression. Business failures accelerate as companies that were economically marginal before metric conversion find that the transition costs exceed their financial capacity. Small shops that operated on thin profit margins cannot afford new equipment, cannot absorb the productivity losses from worker retraining, and cannot maintain customer loyalty when confusion about measurements creates disputes about whether customers are receiving correct quantities. Trade collapses when merchants from different regions attempt to conduct business using metric measurements that they understand differently or calculate incorrectly. The metric system was supposed to facilitate commerce by creating universal standards. But during the transition period, it actually made trade more difficult by introducing new sources of confusion and conflict. International trade becomes even more complicated when French merchants using metric units try to deal with foreign merchants using traditional measurements. Price chaos emerges when merchants attempt to convert traditional prices to metric equivalents while maintaining profit margins during periods of inflation, currency instability, and revolutionary economic policies that include price controls and rationing. The mathematical calculations required for accurate price conversion exceed the abilities of many merchants and customers, creating opportunities for both honest mistakes and deliberate fraud. Market manipulation by unscrupulous merchants exploits metric confusion to cheat customers who don't understand the new measurements well enough to recognize when they're being overcharged or shortchanged. The enforcement agents who are supposed to prevent fraud are often equally confused about metric calculations, creating situations where they can't distinguish between honest errors and deliberate cheating. Bankruptcy waves sweep through French commerce as businesses fail from combination of revolutionary disruption, war-related economic problems, and metric conversion costs. The bankruptcy process under revolutionary law is harsh and unforgiving, with failed business owners facing prosecution for fraud, even when their failures result from circumstances beyond their control. The threat of prosecution for business failure creates a climate of fear that discourages entrepreneurship and risk-taking. Employment crises develop as failing businesses dismiss workers who cannot be retained during economic contraction. The unemployed workers face grim prospects in a revolutionary economy that's experiencing labor surplus, food shortages, and political instability. Many workers blame metric conversion for their job losses, creating popular resentment toward measurement reform that was supposed to benefit common people. The educational disaster resulting from forced metric adoption reveals the inadequacy of revolutionary France's approach to public instruction. The government mandates that everyone must learn and use metric measurements but provides minimal resources for education that would help citizens understand the new system. Schools receive directives to teach metric units but lack textbooks, visual aids, or trained teachers who understand the system well enough to explain it effectively. Forced re-education programs require adults to attend classes where they're supposed to learn metric measurements. But the instruction is often conducted by teachers who barely understand the material themselves and who rely on intimidation rather than effective pedagogy. Adults who spent decades using traditional measurements find it difficult to internalize new units that have no connection to their practical experience, creating frustration that manifests as resistance to metric adoption. School curriculum chaos results when educational authorities cannot agree on how to teach metric system to children who are simultaneously learning traditional measurements at home and metric units at school. The conflicting instruction creates confusion about which measurements are correct, leading to generational conflicts where children and parents use incompatible measurement systems and cannot communicate effectively about quantities. The literacy problems associated with metric terminology create barriers for citizens who have limited reading abilities and cannot master the new vocabulary required for metric measurements. The metric system introduces terms like kilogram, centimeter, and hectoliter that have no connection to familiar language, while traditional terms like pound, a foot, and gallon are embedded in common speech and cultural references that make them easier to remember and use. Resistance movements develop underground networks that teach traditional measurements and provide access to non-metric measuring equipment. These movements frame metric adoption as cultural imperialism that destroys traditional knowledge and forces everyone to think in ways that benefit educated elites, while disadvantaging common people who lack mathematical sophistication perform decimal calculations easily. Cultural destruction accelerates as metric measurements replace traditional units that were embedded in cultural practices, folk wisdom, and practical knowledge accumulated over generations. The traditional measurements weren't arbitrary conventions, but were often based on human proportions and practical needs, making them intuitively understandable in ways that abstract decimal measurements are not. Recipe disasters occur when cooks attempt to convert traditional recipes to metric measurements without understanding the relationships between volume, weight, and ingredient properties. The traditional recipes often specified measurements like a handful or enough to fill a cup that reflected practical cooking experience rather than precise quantities, making literal conversion to metric units difficult or impossible. Building failures result from construction workers attempting to use metric measurements for projects designed in traditional units, leading to errors that cause structural problems or create buildings with dimensions that don't match their intended purposes. The conversion between measurement systems requires mathematical calculations that exceed the abilities of many tradespeople who learn their crafts through apprenticeship rather than formal education. Medical errors multiply when physicians and pharmacists attempt to convert drug dosages from traditional to metric measurements, creating opportunities for calculation, mistakes that can kill patients through overdoses or render treatments ineffective through underdosing. The medical profession's transition to metric units occurs without adequate training or safety protocols, making the early adoption period particularly dangerous for patients. As your third week ends, you understand that metric system adoption wasn't a peaceful scientific triumph, but a violent social transformation imposed through political terror during one of history's most chaotic periods. The measurement reform that's presented as rational progress was actually traumatic cultural destruction that killed scientists, bankrupted businesses, and created economic and social chaos that persisted for decades. Tonight, you'll sleep in revolutionary Paris, where measurement errors can result in execution, where scientists are murdered for political reasons while their scientific work continues under threat, and where the rational decimal system is being forced on a population through irrational violence. Tomorrow will bring more enforcement actions against people whose only crime is confusion about measurements that nobody fully understands. The political terror that accompanied metric adoption reveals that scientific progress isn't always achieved through enlightened reason, but sometimes requires violence, coercion, and the destruction of traditional knowledge that served human needs reasonably well before being replaced by systems that claim superiority based on arbitrary criteria. Your fourth week in revolutionary Paris begins with a discovery that transforms your understanding of why the metric system claims superiority over traditional measurements. You've gained access to the Scientific Commission's confidential records, and they reveal that virtually every natural and rational principle underlying the metric system is either based on miscalculations, arbitrary choices, or compromises that contradict the system's foundational philosophy. The elegant simplicity that metric advocates celebrate is actually a carefully constructed myth that obscures a measurement system almost as arbitrary as the ones it replaced. The morning starts in the archives of the National Convention, where dusty documents reveal the debates, disagreements, and outright disasters that characterized metric system development. The records show that scientists argued bitterly about fundamental definitions. Politicians overruled scientific recommendations for arbitrary reasons, and practical implementation repeatedly contradicted theoretical principles because reality refused to cooperate with revolutionary idealism. The meter definition that's celebrated as being based on Earth's natural dimensions turns out to be based on measurements that were wrong by approximately 2 kilometers, or about 0.2% of the total distance from pole to equator. This error occurred because the scientists measuring the meridian made assumptions about Earth's shape that were incorrect, used instruments that had systematic calibration errors, and performed calculations that included mathematical mistakes. The more embarrassing truth is that the scientists knew their measurements had significant error margins, but proceeded with the meter definition anyway because political pressure demanded results and because they convinced themselves that future measurements would confirm their calculations. When later scientists discovered the errors, the meter had already been established as the standard. So rather than redefining it based on corrected Earth measurements, they simply declared that the meter was whatever length the original definition produced, even though it didn't actually equal 1/10,000,000th of the pole to equator distance. This means the meter is essentially as arbitrary as defining it as the length of this specific metal bar, because it's no longer tied to any natural constant that can be independently verified. The natural basis for the meter is a historical fiction that's maintained because admitting the arbitrariness would undermine metric systems' claims to superiority over traditional measurements that were honestly arbitrary rather than pretending to be natural. The kilogram definition reveals even more fundamental arbitrariness. The kilogram was supposed to be defined as the mass of 1 liter of water at a specific temperature, which sounds scientifically rigorous until you examine the practical problems. Water's density varies with temperature, pressure, dissolved gases, and isotopic composition in ways that make it impossible to maintain precise mass standards based on water volume. The scientists quickly abandoned the water-based definition and created a physical artifact, a cylinder of platinum-iridium alloy that was declared to be exactly 1 kilogram by definition. This means the fundamental unit of mass in the supposedly natural and rational metric system is actually defined as whatever this specific chunk of metal in Paris weighs, which is precisely as arbitrary as traditional weight standards that were based on physical artifacts like standardized stones or metal weights. The platinum-iridium kilogram artifact introduces additional problems because physical objects change mass over time through surface contamination, atomic decay, and interactions with the environment. The official kilogram is stored under multiple bell jars in a vault in Paris and is only removed for comparisons every few decades. But measurements show that it's losing mass at a rate of approximately 50 micrograms per century compared to copies made from the same material. This means that the kilogram isn't actually constant, which creates the philosophical problem of whether the official kilogram defines the unit regardless of its changing mass, or whether the copies that show different mass trends are somehow more correct than the official standard. The metric system resolved this paradox by declaring that the kilogram is whatever the official artifact weighs by definition, making the fundamental unit of mass dependent on a physical object that's gradually changing. Temperature scales reveal the arbitrariness of measurement choices even within systems that claim rational foundations. The Celsius scale, that's standard in metric countries, was initially proposed with water freezing at 100 degrees and boiling at 0 degrees, which was later reversed to create the modern scale where water freezes at 0 and boils at 100 degrees Celsius at standard pressure. The Celsius scale seems natural because it's based on water's phase transitions. But this naturalness is somewhat illusory because water's freezing and boiling points depend on pressure, dissolved impurities, and other factors that vary with circumstances. The Fahrenheit scale that Americans use was based on different reference points, including the freezing point of a saltwater mixture and human body temperature, which seem arbitrary until you realize they were chosen for practical calibration purposes. The practical advantages of Fahrenheit for everyday temperature measurement become apparent when you compare the scales. Fahrenheit provides more precision without decimal points because the degree intervals are smaller, making it better suited for describing weather and room temperatures that humans actually experience. The range from 0 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit roughly corresponds to the range of temperatures that humans consider livable, while Celsius has 0 to 100 spanning from moderately cold to lethally hot, with most human-relevant temperatures compressed into a much smaller range. The conversion impossibilities between metric and traditional units reveal that decimal organization doesn't necessarily make calculations easier or more intuitive. Converting between inches and centimeters requires multiplying by 2.54, which is not a convenient decimal fraction. Converting between pounds and kilograms requires multiplying by 0.453592, which is even worse. The conversions between measurement systems involve irrational ratios that cannot be expressed as simple decimals, making precise conversion impossible without rounding errors. The rounding errors that accumulate during conversion between measurement systems create practical problems in manufacturing, engineering, and scientific work where precision matters. A measurement that's exact in inches becomes approximate when converted to millimeters, and converting back to inches produces a slightly different value than the original measurement. The conversion errors are usually small, but they accumulate through repeated calculations and can eventually produce significant discrepancies. Industry resistance to metric conversion reflects genuine practical problems rather than mere resistance to change. Factories designed around inch-based tooling cannot easily switch to metric dimensions without replacing entire production lines. The replacement costs are substantial, and the benefits of metric measurements don't necessarily justify the expense when existing systems work adequately. Infrastructure incompatibility creates long-term barriers to metric adoption because existing buildings, roads, and utilities are designed using traditional measurements that cannot be easily converted. Pipe fittings, lumber dimensions, and construction materials are standardized in traditional units. And changing these standards would require replacing or adapting enormous amounts of existing infrastructure. The cost prohibitions of complete metric conversion explain why most countries that officially adopted metric measurements continue using traditional units for many practical purposes. Britain officially went metric decades ago, but still uses miles for road distances, pints for beer, and stones for body weight. Canada uses metric officially, but uses imperial units extensively in construction and manufacturing. Even France, the birthplace of the metric system, uses traditional measurements for some purposes because complete conversion proved impractical. Metric creep refers to the gradual adoption of metric units over decades or centuries, which contradicts the revolutionary ideal of immediate, complete conversion. Most countries that successfully adopted metric measurements did so gradually, allowing traditional and metric units to coexist for extended periods, while people slowly became comfortable with new measurements. The gradual approach was more successful than revolutionary imposition, but took much longer and created situations where mixed measurement systems persist. Hybrid systems that combine metric and traditional units demonstrate that measurement choices depend on practical needs rather than abstract principles. Aircraft altitude is measured in feet worldwide, including in countries that use metric measurements exclusively for everything else, because the foot provides convenient intervals for altitude separation. Computer storage uses binary units that don't align with either metric or traditional decimal systems because binary organization matches how computers actually work. Country variations in metric implementation show that the supposedly universal system isn't actually standardized globally. Different countries use different combinations of metric units, prefer different multiples of base units, and maintain traditional measurements for specific purposes based on local preferences and practical needs. Practical adjustments to metric system include abandoning decimal time and calendar reforms that proved completely impractical, demonstrating that decimal organization isn't inherently superior for all purposes. The failure of decimal time revealed that human time perception and social organization around 7-day weeks couldn't be easily changed through measurement reform. The centimeter invention represents a departure from pure decimal thinking because it introduces a unit that's 1/100th of a meter rather than 1/10th, creating an intermediate scale that's more practical for everyday measurements than using meters with decimal fractions. The centimeter wasn't part of the original metric system, but was added because people found the gap between millimeters and meters too large for convenient use. American exceptionalism in measurement reflects practical wisdom rather than stubborn resistance to progress. The United States officially adopted metric measurements for scientific and military purposes while maintaining traditional units for commerce and everyday life, because the mixed system serves practical needs better than exclusive use of either system. Americans use metric measurements when precision and international compatibility matter, and use traditional measurements when intuitive understanding and cultural familiarity are more important. The rejection history includes multiple failed attempts to force metric adoption in the United States, demonstrating that measurement reform requires popular acceptance rather than government mandate. The Metric Conversion Act, passed in the 1970s, attempted to encourage voluntary adoption but failed because most Americans saw no compelling reason to abandon measurements that worked adequately for their needs. Failed conversion attempts reveal that measurement system success depends on meeting users' practical needs rather than conforming to abstract principles of rationality. The traditional units that Americans continue using have advantages for everyday purposes that offset any theoretical benefits of metric measurements. The dual system chaos in the United States creates inefficiencies and occasional errors when people confuse metric and traditional units. but it also provides flexibility to use whichever measurement system works best for specific purposes. American engineers use metric measurements for international projects and traditional units for domestic work, demonstrating that competent professionals can work effectively in multiple measurement systems. Global isolation is less significant than metric advocates claim because American economic and technological influence means that traditional measurements remain important worldwide, regardless of official metric adoption in other countries. International trade and scientific cooperation function effectively despite measurement system differences, suggesting that universal adoption of metric measurements isn't necessary for global coordination. The practical advantages of traditional units include more intuitive subdivisions for common fractions. The inch divides evenly into halves, quarters, eighths, and sixteenths, while the centimeter's decimal divisions create awkward fractions for common subdivisions. The foot divides evenly into halves, thirds, quarters, and sixths, providing more options for fractional measurements than the meter's decimal divisions. As your fourth week ends, you understand that the metric system's claims to natural rationality are largely mythological, and the system's actual advantages are matters of convention and familiarity rather than inherent superiority. The traditional measurements that the metric system replaced were arbitrary. But the metric system is also arbitrary while pretending to be natural. The real difference is that metric measurements won political battles and became standard through force and institutional adoption, rather than demonstrating clear superiority that convinced people to voluntarily abandon traditional measurements. Tonight, you'll sleep knowing that measurement systems are human conventions that serve practical needs, and that claims of rationality are usually post hoc justifications for arbitrary choices. Tomorrow will bring your final week in revolutionary Paris, where you'll witness the long-term consequences of imposing measurement reform through political violence. Your fifth and final week doesn't begin in revolutionary Paris, but in the present day, where you've returned to discover that the metric system has achieved global dominance, not through demonstrating superiority, but through institutional inertia, colonial imposition, and the simple fact that once enough countries adopted it, switching costs made alternatives impractical. The modern world lives with metric measurements not because they're better, but because they're established, which is essentially the same reason people used traditional measurements for centuries before metric reform. The first thing you notice about modern measurement reality is that the meter has been redefined multiple times since its revolutionary origins, with each redefinition abandoning more of the original natural basis in favor of arbitrary standards based on whatever physical constants scientists currently consider most convenient. The meter is no longer 1/10,000,000th of the pole to equator distance, because that definition was based on wrong measurements and isn't precise enough for modern science. The current meter definition, established in the late 20th century, defines the meter as the distance light travels in vacuum during 1/299,792,458 of a second. This definition sounds impressively precise until you realize it's completely circular, because the second is defined using atomic clock measurements that themselves depend on other arbitrary choices about which atomic transitions to use as time standards. The scientific redefinitions of metric units occur regularly as measurement technology improves and scientists decide that previous definitions aren't precise enough for current needs. These redefinitions mean that the meter you're using today isn't actually the same length as the meter that was used 50 years ago, though the differences are small enough that they only matter for scientific applications requiring extreme precision. The kilogram redefinition in recent years finally abandoned the physical artifact standard in favor of defining the kilogram using fundamental physical constants. This change was celebrated as making the kilogram finally based on natural principles. But it actually made the definition dependent on complicated physics that requires advanced laboratory equipment to verify, making the kilogram less accessible and more abstract than the old standard of this specific chunk of metal weighs 1 kilogram. Multiple definitions of metric units throughout history create the paradoxical situation where measurements that are supposed to be universal and permanent have actually changed repeatedly based on scientific fashion and technological capability. The metric system's stability is somewhat illusory, as the definitions have been modified enough times that historical metric measurements aren't necessarily compatible with modern metric measurements, except through conversion factors that reintroduce the kind of complications that the metric system was supposed to eliminate. Precision illusions in metric measurements arise from the assumption that decimal organization inherently provides better accuracy than traditional measurements, when actual precision depends on measuring instruments and techniques rather than unit definitions. A measurement in inches can be just as precise as a measurement in millimeters if the measuring instruments have equivalent quality and the user exercises equivalent care. The practical problems that metric system was supposed to solve often persist in metric-using countries because measurement system choice doesn't actually eliminate the underlying issues. Fraud, mistakes, and confusion about quantities occur, regardless of whether measurements use metric or traditional units. The decimal organization of metric measurements makes some calculations easier, but creates other complications when dealing with fractions that don't convert cleanly to decimal notation. Computer complications reveal that neither metric nor traditional measurements align perfectly with how computers actually process information. Computers use binary arithmetic, which doesn't correspond naturally to either decimal metric units or traditional fractional divisions. The measurement system problems in computing require conversions and approximations, regardless of whether the source measurements are metric or traditional. The imperial advantage in human-scaled measurements becomes apparent when comparing how traditional and metric units relate to human body proportions and everyday experience. The foot is approximately the length of a human foot. The inch is roughly the width of a thumb, and the yard is approximately a stride length. These relationships make traditional measurements intuitively understandable in ways that abstract metric units are not. Practical divisibility of traditional units provides advantages for common fractions that metric measurements handle awkwardly. Base 12 organization of inches per foot creates convenient divisions into halves, thirds, quarters, sixths, and twelfths, while base 10 metric organization only divides evenly into halves and fifths. When working with fractions, traditional measurements often require simpler arithmetic than metric equivalents. Cultural persistence of traditional measurements in officially metric countries demonstrates that human preferences and practical needs often override official standardization. British people continue using miles, pints, and stones for many purposes. Despite decades of metric education, Canadian construction workers use feet and inches. Even though official measurements are metric, French markets sell produce by the pound, even though kilograms are the legal standard. Measurement mixing occurs even in countries with strong metric traditions, because different measurement systems have advantages for different purposes. Height measurements in centimeters require larger numbers than measurements in feet and inches, making traditional units more convenient for describing human heights. Temperature in Celsius requires negative numbers for common winter weather, while Fahrenheit keeps most human-relevant temperatures in positive ranges. Intuitive understanding of Fahrenheit temperature makes it arguably superior to Celsius for weather forecasting and climate control. The Fahrenheit scale from 0 to 100 degrees roughly corresponds to the range of temperatures that humans experience as livable, with temperatures below 0 being dangerously cold and temperatures above 100 being dangerously hot. The Celsius scale has most human-relevant temperatures compressed between -20 and +35 degrees, making the numbers less intuitive. Aviation chaos demonstrates that even international industries that require global standardization haven't fully adopted metric measurements. Aircraft altitude worldwide is measured in feet because the foot provides convenient intervals for vertical separation between flight levels. Changing to meters would require retraining all pilots, reprogramming all equipment, and revising all procedures, with the only benefit being conformity to metric standards that provide no practical advantage for aviation. Medical errors from measurement confusion occur in both metric and traditional measurement contexts, though the specific types of errors differ. Metric countries experience dosing mistakes when healthcare workers confuse milligrams with micrograms or milliliters with liters. Traditional measurement countries have similar problems with grains, drams, and ounces. The fundamental issue is that measurement errors result from human mistakes rather than measurement system choice. Engineering disasters attributed to measurement confusion are often more complicated than simple conversion errors. The Mars Climate Orbiter failure that's frequently blamed on mixing metric and imperial units actually resulted from multiple organizational and communication failures where measurement confusion was one factor among many. The spacecraft was lost because different teams didn't verify that they were using compatible units. But the underlying problem was inadequate coordination rather than inherent incompatibility between measurement systems. Trade complications in international commerce persist, regardless of measurement standardization, because business transactions involve many sources of confusion beyond unit differences. Metric adoption hasn't eliminated disputes about quantity, quality, or pricing in international trade. The measurement system provides a common vocabulary but doesn't solve underlying commercial challenges. Consumer confusion about product labeling demonstrates that metric measurements don't automatically create clarity. Packages listing contents in grams and milliliters don't necessarily help consumers understand whether they're getting good value, because most people don't have intuitive understanding of what specific metric quantities represent. The confusion that existed with traditional measurements often persists with metric units because people haven't developed the experiential knowledge needed for intuitive quantity estimation. The modern measurement wars continue as metric advocates push for universal adoption, while traditional measurement defenders argue for maintaining familiar units that serve practical needs effectively. The debate generates more heat than light because both sides are arguing about conventions and preferences rather than objective superiority of either measurement system. Legacy of measurement tribalism reflects how humans attach identity and meaning to arbitrary conventions. People defend their preferred measurement systems with passion that seems disproportionate to the actual importance of unit choice, because measurements become cultural markers that represent tradition, national identity, and resistance to external pressure. Cultural attachment to measurement units creates barriers to change that rational arguments cannot overcome. Americans resist metric adoption partly because traditional measurements feel American and metric units feel foreign, making measurement choice a form of cultural expression rather than practical calculation. This cultural dimension explains why measurement reform requires generational change rather than logical persuasion. The American metric resistance, being rational, acknowledges that the United States has legitimate reasons for maintaining traditional measurements beyond mere stubbornness. The infrastructure, industry, and cultural practices built around traditional units represent enormous investments that cannot be abandoned without significant costs. The benefits of metric adoption are primarily symbolic and diplomatic rather than practical, making the conversion difficult to justify on cost-benefit grounds. The connection to current measurement debates shows that the fundamental issues from revolutionary France persist today. Measurement standardization involves trade-offs between competing values like precision versus intuitive understanding, universal adoption versus local preference, and mathematical elegance versus practical convenience. These trade-offs don't have objectively correct resolutions, making measurement choice ultimately a matter of convention rather than absolute rationality. As your final week ends, you understand that the metric system's global dominance doesn't reflect inherent superiority, but rather historical accidents, colonial imposition, and institutional momentum that made metric adoption the path of least resistance for most countries during periods of modernization. The system works adequately for its purposes. But so did the traditional measurements it replaced. And the transition costs were substantial enough that complete global adoption required more than a century and still isn't complete. Tonight, you'll sleep in a world where measurement systems are arbitrary conventions that serve practical needs with varying degrees of effectiveness. The metric system isn't rationally superior to traditional measurements, just different and more widespread due to historical circumstances. Both systems have advantages and disadvantages, and the choice between them reflects cultural preferences, practical considerations, and historical accidents rather than objective superiority. Tomorrow will bring new opportunities to use whatever measurements are convenient for immediate purposes without worrying too much about whether they conform to someone's abstract ideals of rationality. The lesson from metric system history is that measurement standardization is useful but not sacred, and that practical needs should take precedence over ideological commitments to particular unit systems. Sweet dreams of using whichever measurements make sense for your immediate purposes. Whether that's metric units for scientific work, traditional units for construction projects, or some combination that serves practical needs better than dogmatic adherence to either system. The measurement wars are over. And the result is peaceful coexistence of multiple systems that work adequately for different purposes in different contexts. The metric system achieved global adoption through political force, colonial imposition, and institutional inertia rather than rational superiority. And its continued dominance reflects convention and switching costs rather than inherent advantages. Traditional measurements persist where they serve practical needs better than metric alternatives, demonstrating that both systems have legitimate uses and that measurement choice is ultimately arbitrary despite everyone's claims to rationality.